It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 59. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. And this is the Pro Wrestling History Podcast dedicated to professional wrestling history from 1870 to 1920. And surprise, surprise, we are back here and it's another solo episode. As anyone that has gone through this process with a family member will be able to tell you, things look really good when a family member is going through some health issues and it looks like they're going to come home and then they have a setback. And unfortunately, that's what's happened with my normal co-host, Dangerous Dan, my cousin. He was supposed to come home last Saturday, June 29th, and when we went to pick him up, he was back in the hospital with another procedure, which has pushed his release date back to July 25th. We could have got him on the podcast, except he's also damaged his phone, and we need to get him a headset for the Skype sessions. So either he's going to be back home in another 3 weeks, or we will have him on the last podcast of July when we get him the headset. But this is going to continue to be a work in progress, so I hope you're enjoying the episodes anyway. I hope that I'm filling it with enough history to keep you interested, and I appreciate your patience as we work through this. Nobody wants to be back on the podcast more than Dan does, and he's been in and out of different medical facilities, to quote Vince McMahon, since early February, and he's getting pretty sick of seeing hospital beds and medical personnel. I'm not going to review either pay-per-view that occurred over the last 2 weeks, AEW Forbidden Door or WWE's Money in the Bank. AEW's Forbidden Door pay-per-view was a 15-match card. Now, 5 of those matches were on the 1-hour pre-show, but 15 matches is ridiculous. I don't know who would want to sit through such a marathon. And most of the wrestlers involved in that show are from other promotions outside the United States. So a lot of the wrestling fans, unless you're a hardcore, which most of the hardcores do watch AEW, you probably don't know who the wrestlers are. And I think it was borne out in their numbers. They had 11,000 in the building and 100 to 115,000 buys on pay-per-view, which is not a very big pay-per-view buy. The UFC 300 event, which is an unusual event, but they did 1 million buys, and I think it's pretty common for them to have 300 to 400 buys per pay-per-view. And I'm imagining that's what the WWE was in before they went to a network, and now most of them are just premium live events. The WWE pay-per-view I would have found more palatable. It was only 5 or 6 matches, which has become their norm. And it's a 2.5 to 3 hour event, which is what I think is ideal for a wrestling card. But besides my lack of interest in the modern product, I think WWE had better be very careful. They've not made many bad moves under Paul Triple H Levesque, but I think they're getting ready to lose the fans with the way they're using both Jey Uso and Drew McIntyre. You can only have them chasing for so long and never winning the title before the fans start to just kind of go, oh, here we go again, and they start to lose interest. So I think they need to be pretty careful. The chances that I was going to watch Money in the Bank were not very good because anything that is built around a ladder match is almost guaranteed that I will not watch it. As I've said, if I never see another ladder match in my entire life, it will be too soon. And I've just returned to modern wrestling within the last 3 or 4 years because of my writing and because of doing the podcast. I've started to watch again, something that I didn't do through the 2010s at all or the late 2000s. And even the stuff that was going on in the 90s, outside of the stuff with Bret Hart, I wasn't liking the product at all. I grew up on St. Louis wrestling, in the early 80s, which was the straightest promotion and was treated like a sport and never really got into the comic book elements of the WWF, eventually becoming the WWE. But since we do the podcast, I do try to keep up with the modern product enough to at least talk about it. And if there's something good I see, I will review it. But if I watch a decent match from Money in the Bank, I may say something about it in the future. But that is not on the review schedule for the next 3 or 4 podcasts. The review I'm going to do this week is a portion of a match of about 4 or 5 minutes that's from the 1950s in Dallas, Texas. And it's the only video footage that I have found of this particular wrestler. So I want to review that match at the end of the episode. So I think we'll jump right into the history topic this week. And the history topic I'm going to talk about is the younger brothers of John the Nebraska Tigerman Pesek. So Pesek was a well thought of hooker and shooter from the teens, 1920s and 1930s. He was involved in several legitimate contests to settle, or in one case, start a promotional war. And he was also involved in a famous double cross. But he also had 2 younger brothers, and when I say younger brothers, it's almost 2 years difference between them. So John Pesek was born in February of 1894. His younger twin brothers, Hubert and Charley, were born in November of 1895. So just a little under 2 years apart. And both Charley and Hubert were smaller. They were middleweight, lightweight wrestlers, and they followed Pesek into the professional wrestling ranks. While they were solid, lighter weight wrestlers, they never achieved the fame of their older brother, and a couple circumstances interfered with their careers, but the biggest reason that they did not get over like John did was their lack of size. Even back in the 19-teens and 1920s, even though you had middleweight and light heavyweight, lightweight wrestlers that wrestled, they were never the top of the card. They were never the big stars. Fans even then seemed to prefer the heavyweight wrestlers. And so you had a very limited opportunity as a middleweight or a lightweight, even a light heavyweight wrestler, even back in the early days of the sport. Charley was a little bit more famous than Hubert. Couple reasons for that, but Charley is probably most famous for in the 1920s. He wrestled a training match on his brother John's farm with Joe Stecker's training partner. They were both middleweight wrestlers. And John Pesek put up a certain amount of money, and Joe Stecker put up a brand new automobile that he had bought. And Charley Pesek wrestled Stecker's training partner, and Charley Pesek won the match, which meant his brother received the automobile, which he gave to his younger brother Charley to drive around. Charley continued wrestling into the 20s, but eventually he would become his brother's main partner in both his farm and his dog racing business. So John Pesek made more money as a trainer and breeder of greyhound racing dogs than he did as a professional wrestler. And as that business continued to grow, Charley Pesek was very involved in it. And he would be his brother's main partner. When John was busy traveling the world on his wrestling tours, Charley would often take the dogs from the kennel to the races and would race the dogs. And a lot of people gave Charley as much credit for the success of the Rainbow Kennel Club, which was the Peseks Greyhound Racing Club, as they did John. Hubert's career did not go as far as Charley's did, and one of the main reasons was because Hubert Pesek served in the U.S. Army in World War I. And not only did he serve in the U.S. Army in World War I, but In 1918, the Pesek family was notified that Hubert had been killed in France. And a newspaper article ran in the Ravenna Times in December of 1918, and it was a memorial tribute to Hubert Pesek. A friend of the late Hubert Pesek, a soldier with the American Expeditionary Force in France, sends the following obituary sketch for publication. Hubert Pesek was born November 3, 1896, near Gibbon, Nebraska, and was killed in action in France October 11, 1918, at the age of 22 years, 11 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. He leaves to mourn for him a mother, 4 brothers, and 1 sister. Hubert Pesek enlisted August 25, 1917, and was in the Army 1 year, 1 month, and 16 days, saw active service, and went over the top 15 times. So he went over the top of the trench 15 times. He was a loving, dutiful son, and will be affectionately remembered by the members of his family, as well as the community and a large number of friends. He will be greatly missed by all who knew him. He was universally respected, and his memory will be cherished as a sturdy, manly youth and as a brave soldier who made the supreme sacrifice for his country. So, everybody believed that Hubert Pesek had passed away while serving in France. But they found out in April of 1919. Now realize, his mom, his brothers, his family, they all believed Hubert Pesek had been killed because one of the servicemen that was with him saw him shot out in no man's land and saw him picked up by an ambulance, and they thought he was dead. That's the word that everybody got. But the article in the April 1919 Ravenna Times says, Hubert Pesek fooled him. Company H man reported killed October 11th, turns up on right side of Atlantic. Member of famous wrestling family. So after he had been mourned as dead for 6 months, Hubert Curly Pesek, Curly was his nickname, is now reported alive and en route home. The Pesek family found out that he was still alive when they got a telegram from the U.S. War Department saying, hey, your son has just arrived in Newport News, Virginia from the Atlantic, and he is recovering from his wounds. And John Pesek, who said he would never believe that his brother had been killed, actually thought that he had his doubts that his brother was alive until they got the clipping from the War Department, because a friend of his had told John Pesek, hey, your brother's still alive. He was just injured. And Pesek was doubtful. He said, well, the Army has already told us that, he's dead. But then when he got the telegram from the War Department, he realized, there's been some kind of snafu. They crossed their wires, and they didn't give us the right information. So in April, Hubert Pesek comes home to Ravenna, and they realize that he's been in the hospital for 6 months because he was gassed. Besides being catching shrapnel, he was gassed out there in no man's land, and it took a long time for him to recover. And he never regained the athletic vigor that he once had. They said when he came back that they knew that his wrestling career was over. So Hubert goes into the family business of farming. But for whatever reason, he was not as close to John as his brother Charlie was. So Hubert, and he gets married, and he and his wife have their own farm, and he spends all his time just as a farmer in Ravenna, Nebraska. And Hubert would actually outlive everybody. He lived into the 1980s, and he was in his early 90s when he passed away. But back in 1918, they thought he had been killed in France. Charles continues wrestling a little bit, but he is primarily involved in the dog racing business. He has also gotten married, and he and his wife, though, split up not too long after the marriage, and while they're not divorced, they're not living together either. So in 1934, Charles Pesek is 39 years old, and he is out with their stable of dogs, and he's in the Northwest where he's racing the dogs for about 4 or 5 months. And very successful trip. The Pesek stable of horses. The Pesek stable of greyhound racing dogs have won many of the races. They were one of the most successful stables in the 1930s and 40s. And like I said, they made John Pesek a fortune. A lot of the books I've read on Pesek and what they mention is greyhound racing prowess, they say that when he took his tour of Australia in 1929, that he learned the Australian way of breeding and racing the greyhounds, and that's what made them such a successful greyhound racing stable when he came back. In actuality, he found that the Australian greyhounds were a little bit bigger. The average American greyhound at the time was between 60 and 65 pounds, and the average greyhound in Australia was between 75 and 85 pounds. And he brought back 2 prize greyhounds with him when he came back to Nebraska from Australia in 1929. One was Just Andrew, who had a championship pedigree, and his offspring had a championship pedigree. And he also was able to purchase the winner of the South Wales Greyhound Cup race that year. And he bred those dogs with some of his other dogs. And he used some of the methods he had always used in training greyhounds. And they had a very, very successful stable. So he really didn't learn a new method of training as much as he imported 2 Australian greyhounds who were bigger and faster, he found. So Charlie is very involved with his brother's greyhound business from the mid-20s all the way up into the 30s. But in 1934, he comes back from Portland, Oregon in early August, and he seems really despondent. And his brother and a couple of their friends notice it, but it's not unusual for Charles to get a little down, and he's really been down since he and his wife separated. Pauline was his wife's name, and since they had separated, he's been down, but it's nothing too unusual for Charlie. So on the night of August the 4th, he's at his brother John's farm. He's just brought the dogs back, and he's talking with one of the hired hands that helps him with the dogs, a gentleman by the name of Melvin Purcell. And as Charlie's talking to him, he pulls a .38 revolver out of his pocket and says, I just can't take it anymore. I'm going to kill myself. Well, at first, Melvin thinks he's joking because they've been working together all day. He's not shown any despondency or anything. When he realizes that Charles is serious, he rushes him and tries to get the gun away from him, but Charlie shoots himself before he can get to him. They get him emergency medical care immediately. An ambulance comes and takes him to the hospital in Grand Island. Remember, they're out in Ravenna, very small town in Nebraska. They get him to Grand Island, but he never regains consciousness, and he dies at 4 a.m. that Sunday morning. The police come, but it's an obvious case of suicide, and they realize under all of the circumstances that either unhappiness with his personal situation, unhappiness with being away from home, whatever it was, has played on his mind and caused him to take his own life. His brother John is incredibly despondent, And he is scheduled to wrestle a charity match in Omaha that Monday night, August the 7th. He doesn't want to wrestle, but the Nebraska Athletic Commission tells him if he does not show up to wrestle this charity match, that they are going to strip him of his wrestling license. So very reluctantly, John travels to Omaha, and he tells the organizers, this is going to be a fast match because I'm going to get back to Ravenna because they were going to bury Charles the next day on the 8th. Well, the organizers are sympathetic to John's situation. They announce to the crowd what happened and that John Pesek is willing to go on with the match if they demand, but he's trying to get back to Ravenna because of Charles's funeral the next day. And the fans all unanimously yell, no, no, go, go. And the organizers substitute another wrestler. So kudos to the organizers for having good common sense. And shame on the State Athletic Commission for their officiousness in such a trying time for someone. After Charles' suicide, John becomes more involved in the Greyhound business and wrestles less. In fact, one of the times that they put the Midwest Wrestling Association world title on him, he actually loses it for inactivity for just not defending the title. He still wrestles occasionally, but the racing schedule takes more and more of his time, and he's not able to wrestle nearly as much as he used to as he continues the championship development of his Greyhound stable that he and Charles had built up. One of the things that I had always heard prior to writing the book on John Pesek was that because of the double cross on Joe Stecker in 1926, so just to bring people up to speed really quickly, John Pesek wrestled Joe Stecker 3 times in 1926. In 1925, there was a famous double cross where Stanislaus Zbyszko shoots on Big Wayne Munn and takes the title from him legitimately. Zbyszko drops the title to Joe Stecker, and Munn drops the title back to Ed Lewis. And why you would say, well, he doesn't have a title to drop back to him. He does because the promoters are politically connected and worked with state athletic commissions where states would not recognize Zbyszko's title win. So Munn was still considered the champion in those states, and that's the states that Lewis became the champion of. Same thing for Stecker. Stecker was not an undisputed champion, but he was a champion. He had a world title that was recognized in New York, Pennsylvania, a couple other places. And the title was divided until February of 1928 when Lewis and Stecker had a shoot contest to settle the thing. But Stecker was very concerned about double crosses from his partners, so he was careful to wrestle people he trusted more often than not. And one of the people he trusted, even though he had been involved with Sandow's promotion and the Goldust Trio, Billy Sandow, Ed Strangler Lewis, and Joseph Toots Montt, were the group that backed Lewis and Munn when Lewis dropped the title to him. Even though Pesek had been involved with them through most of the mid-20s, Stecker trusted Pesek, whether it was because they were fellow Nebraskans, they knew each other pretty well. And so he wrestled 3 worked matches with Pesek. The first 2 in St. Louis and Los Angeles went without a hitch. The second match in Los Angeles on October 7th, 1926, the match was going according to the plan they had. They each won a fall, working with each other. And then Stecker let Pesek put a double arm wrist lock on him. You may know it from MMA as a Kimura. And Pesek cranked it for real and made him submit in the ring. The fans all saw Stecker submit. In fact, he wept in the ring after it happened. But the referee, who was aligned with the Steckers, disqualified Pesek for any legal chokehold. He said that when he was put in the double arm wrist lock, the point of the elbow was in the throat, and that's an illegal stranglehold. which caused a riot. Fans were throwing seat cushions and everything else, and it was just a big mess. The common story told before all of this was that after Pesek had done that the promoters would no longer book Pesek to wrestle a world champion because they feared he would double-cross him and take the title legitimately. That's not really the case. They continued to let him wrestle. He wrestled Ed Strangler Lewis numerous times. He wrestled Stecker again later on in the 30s when he was the champion, and Stecker was the challenger. And Pesek held the Midwest Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Championship twice, and he held the National Wrestling Association, the first NWA title, not the National Wrestling Alliance that came into being after 1948, but the National Wrestling Association Championship. Pesek also held that for a while. Interestingly, none of his 3 title reigns did he win those in the ring. Governing bodies awarded him the title based on people not willing to wrestle top challengers, etc. And he also didn't lose it in the ring because he was also stripped by those same governing bodies later on. A lot of times for inactivity because he was racing his dogs. And the real reason he was not as active in the 30s and that is because he was more and more involved in greyhound racing, and he made far more money with his greyhound racing than he did in professional wrestling. And after 1934 and his brother taking his life, Pesek had to be more involved with the racing than he had been previously when Charlie was taking care of all of it. So you see in this episode that things that happen outside of the ring can sometimes have a significant effect on things going on in the ring. If Charlie Pesek had not taken his life and had continued with the greyhound racing and managing that, John would have probably continued to focus on wrestling for another 10 years while he still could and make all the money there. And Charlie would have managed the greyhounds and brought in all the money there, and they would have continued their partnership. Unfortunately for everyone involved in the family, Charlie succumbed to despondency in August of 1934, and it changed the plans for John Pesek inside and outside the ring. That is the history topic for this week. Next time when we come back, I am going to probably talk about a legitimate contest of some kind, because our review that we're going to do, because my son Trey is going to be joining us, and I think Caleb is going to be too. We're going to talk about a very famous double cross that occurred in Japan in the 1950s between their top pro wrestler and a living legend of judo. And they had agreed to a draw, but that's not how things turned out. And there is video footage of that on YouTube, so we'll take a look at that. But this week's review isn't much of a review because there's only 4 minutes of the match, but I will put a link at kinzermanjr.com/episode 59 so you can see what remains of this match. But it's the night, they don't specify a year. I think it might have been 57 or 58. In Dallas, there is a match, and Paul Bosch commentates on it. Because he's commentating on footage that occurred a long time ago. But Bulldog Danny Plutchis, who I've heard in all kinds of old Guest the Program shows that Jim Cornette and Brian Last do on their podcasts, I had never seen a match. I had never seen any kind of even photos of Bulldog Danny Plutchis. But fortunately, there's one 4-minute clip on YouTube, and it's a match between Danny McShane, who's a living legend. Well, he's not living anymore, but he's a living legend at the time. And Danny McShane was born in 1912, and he was one of the biggest heels in the history of professional wrestling. According to everybody, a very well-spoken, gentlemanly person outside of the ring. But in the ring, he was the epitome of a heel. But this is a time in Texas where he was starting to turn and become a fan favorite. Bulldog Danny Pletches was a huge heel, and there is no question at all when you see this match that he is acting in the guise of a heel. And his manager at the time, Bulldog Danny Pletches' manager, was Iron Mike DiBiase, the father of Ted DiBiase, and one of the top light heavyweights of all time, as is Danny McShane. Later on, Danny McShane would transition, and he would be the longtime referee in Houston up until the 1970s, early 1980s. But this is a match later in McShane's career, and he's starting to turn face. So he has this brawl, and it is a brawl, with Bulldog Danny Pletches. And you could tell that McShane's normally a bad guy, but he's slowly turning to become the fan favorite, and he's definitely cheered here. Iron Mike DiBiase, if he wanted to be at ringside for this match, the stipulation was that he would have to be in a straitjacket, which he is. And at one point, McShane gets knocked out onto the ring apron. He hits Pletches to knock him back, and then turns around and kicks Iron Mike DiBiase, who's in the straitjacket, right in the chest. And normally these are kind of heel moves, but in this, everybody wants to see Bulldog Pletches and Iron Mike DiBiase get their comeuppance, so he's a fan favorite in this match. So I will put the link on the show notes, and like I said, it's not the full match. It doesn't show how the match ends. It just gives you a little taste of how things were in the 50s, and Bulldog Pletches looks like a lot of the other Bulldogs I've seen in pro wrestling, but he's a lot better. Bulldog Bob Brown was a St. Louis mainstay, and Pletches is sort of built like him. And then Bulldog Brower up in the Northeast, he's built a little bit like him, but Pletches is much more skilled, much more legitimate tough guy when you watch this match. So check that out. I think that's going to be all for this episode. I hope you'll come back in 2 weeks where we're going to talk about a contest and we're going to review a double cross. One of the actual true double crosses. A lot of times in modern parlance, when people start talking about a double cross or people shooting, they're not really shooting. The outcome of the match is not going to change. They are just fighting. They got mad at each other in the middle of the match and start not cooperating with each other anymore and start hitting each other. That's not a contest. That's not a shoot. That's not people agreeing beforehand that we're going to wrestle legitimately. That is people getting mad at each other and not cooperating, or in some cases unprofessional behavior where people are taking liberties. This is an honest-to-goodness double cross. The outcome was changed because of the actions of one person. The other person didn't know it was coming, which is the true definition of a double cross. And we'll analyze that in the next episode. So until then, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.